It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in the small town of Willow Creek. The streets were lined with rows of old houses and small local shops, bathed in the warm glow of street lamps. Emma, a 32-year-old woman, had just finished a long shift at the local bookstore. The day had been hectic, customers coming and going, shelves to organize, and pages to sort, but Emma didn't mind the exhaustion. It had been a long time since she'd felt truly at peace with herself. As she walked along the quiet streets, her mind wandered to the cozy evening ahead. A cup of tea, a good book, and the comforting silence of her apartment. She'd spent so many nights alone since her mother had passed away a year ago. Her mother had been her only family, and her death had left a hollow ache in her heart that Emma had yet to fill. For now, the pain was manageable, but still, it lingered like an uninvited guest, quietly waiting for moments of weakness. As she walked past a small, weathered shop at the corner of Maple Street, something unusual caught her eye: a dog. It stood in front of a drain near the shop, its glossy black fur glistening under the streetlight. The dog's eyes were wide, staring into the dark opening of the drain, a look of deep sadness etched across its face. Emma slowed her pace, her gaze locking with the dog's. There was something about its expression that tugged at her heart. The dog seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. It had a regal appearance, though its sad eyes and tense posture made Emma wonder if it had been abandoned. Despite the overwhelming urge to stop and comfort the dog, Emma chose to keep walking. She told herself that it was probably just a stray, and someone would come along to take care of it soon. After all, she had no time for distractions, she needed rest. But as she reached her apartment and settled into her cozy chair, Emma couldn't shake the image of the dog, staring into the drain with those mournful eyes. The next day, as Emma walked the same route, she saw the dog again. This time, it was still standing over the same drain, its head tilted slightly as it stared down into the dark abyss below. Emma paused, her heart aching for the creature. Something was clearly wrong. She approached the dog carefully, wanting to see if it needed help. The dog eyed her warily as she got closer, but it didn't move. Emma took a step forward, calling softly to it. "Hey, there. Are you okay?" The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't respond. It seemed focused on whatever was down the drain, its body rigid with tension. Emma stood there for a moment, watching the dog's every movement. It was as if the dog was guarding something it couldn't leave behind. Emma couldn't resist any longer. She turned and walked into the shop, hoping to buy something to feed the dog. It looked hungry. Maybe it had been wandering the streets for a while. She picked up a bag of dog treats and returned to where the dog was still standing. "Here you go, little guy," she said gently, setting the treats on the ground in front of the dog. At first, the dog didn't move, but after a few moments, it stepped forward, sniffed the treats, and then did something completely unexpected. Instead of eating them, the dog picked them up one by one and slid them into the drain. Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. She stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. The dog wasn't hungry at all, it was feeding something down there. But what could it be? The dog's actions were deliberate, its focus unwavering. Before she could move any closer, the dog suddenly snapped to attention, its body tense as it growled softly in her direction. Emma froze, a wave of unease washing over her. She had never seen a dog behave like this, and she instinctively took a step back. The message was clear: whatever the dog was guarding, it wasn't going to let anyone near it. Emma's heart raced as she glanced down at the drain. The dog's intense protectiveness left her with more questions than answers. Why was it so fixated on this drain? What could possibly be down there that was worth all of this? But for now, Emma knew she couldn't press further. The dog was clearly protective, and she didn't want to risk angering it. With a heavy heart, she walked away, feeling more confused and concerned than ever. As she headed home, Emma couldn't help but feel drawn back to that drain, to the dog that seemed to know something she didn't. What was it protecting? And why was it so willing to go without food, sacrificing its own comfort for something, or someone, hidden below? The answers eluded her, but one thing was certain: she couldn't shake the feeling that the dog needed her, and somehow, she needed the dog too. The next few days passed by in a blur. Emma continued her routine, going to work at the bookstore, eating her meals alone, and going home to an empty apartment. Yet, every time she passed that street corner, her gaze would inevitably find the dog. It was always there, standing over the same drain, watching it with the same mournful look in its eyes. Emma couldn't understand why it had such a strong pull on her heart, but each time she saw the dog, she felt a deep connection, one that she couldn't explain. On the fourth day, as Emma approached the familiar spot, she noticed something different. The dog wasn't standing by the drain as usual. For a moment, she felt a wave of panic sweep over her, wondering if something had happened to it. She scanned the area, but there was no sign of the black shepherd. Just as she was about to turn away, Emma heard a soft whine from a nearby alley. She followed the sound and found the dog, huddled against a wall, its fur matted with dirt and its eyes filled with exhaustion. It looked up at her, but this time, there was no growl, no hostility. Just a quiet pleading, as if it was asking for help. Emma's heart broke. It was clear that this dog wasn't just any stray, it was suffering. She approached cautiously, not wanting to frighten it. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly, her voice gentle. "You've been out here for a while, haven't you?" The dog didn't move at first, but after a moment, it slowly stood up, its body weak but determined. It wagged its tail slightly, a small, hopeful gesture. Emma reached into her bag, pulling out the treats she'd bought earlier. She set them down in front of the dog, and this time, it didn't hesitate. It sniffed the treats, then devoured them quickly, as though it hadn't eaten in days. Watching the dog eat, Emma felt a surge of protectiveness. She couldn't leave it out here alone anymore. She had to do something. "I'm taking you home," she murmured, even though she wasn't sure what that would mean for her. She wasn't prepared for a pet, but the dog had become a part of her life in a way she hadn't expected. The dog didn't resist when Emma crouched down and extended her hand. It slowly moved closer, allowing her to pet its head. Emma could feel the roughness of its fur, the weariness in its body. It was a stray, but it wasn't feral. It was simply lost. For the next few hours, Emma went through her day in a haze, the dog, whom she had named Shadow, for its dark coat, never leaving her thoughts. She debated the idea of bringing it into her apartment. She wasn't ready for the responsibility. She'd spent so long keeping her heart closed off from the world, especially after losing her mother. And yet, something told her that she couldn't leave Shadow to fend for himself. That night, when Emma returned home, she found herself standing at the door, staring down at the dog. Shadow sat there, patiently waiting, as if he knew this was the moment that would change everything. With a sigh, Emma opened the door. She hesitated for a moment, then motioned for him to come in. To her surprise, Shadow walked inside without hesitation. He looked around, sniffing the air, and then settled down on the floor, his tail wagging slightly as he looked up at her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were filled with small moments of connection. Shadow had clearly been through a lot, his ribs showed, and his coat was thin, but Emma took care of him the best she could. She fed him, made him comfortable, and let him rest. As the days passed, she began to notice something incredible. Shadow wasn't just any stray dog. He seemed to understand her in ways no one else could. It was during one of their quiet evenings together that Emma began to notice the strange behavior again. Shadow would often sit by the window, staring out into the night, as though waiting for something. His ears would perk up at the faintest sound, and his body would tense, as if on high alert. Emma tried not to think too much about it, she simply enjoyed the company of her new companion, who had surprisingly become her emotional anchor. But there were times, especially late at night, when Emma couldn't help but feel like there was something more going on with Shadow. He was protective, more so than any dog she had ever known. And though he had accepted her kindness, there was always a part of him that remained distant, as though holding something back. One afternoon, Emma decided to take Shadow for a walk to the park. As they approached the path near the old oak tree, Shadow suddenly stopped. His body went rigid, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Emma looked around, confused. "What is it, boy?" she asked, but Shadow didn't respond. Instead, he started to pull at the leash, tugging insistently in the direction of the small bridge that crossed a nearby stream. Emma hesitated. She had never seen Shadow act like this before. Something was clearly bothering him. Finally, she followed his lead, wondering what had caught his attention. When they reached the bridge, Shadow paused again, staring down into the water. Emma crouched beside him, looking to see what had him so fixated. At first, she saw nothing but the flowing water, the sunlight dancing across the surface. But then, a small, rustling noise caught her attention. Beneath the bridge, hidden in the shadows, something moved. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. There, trapped beneath the rocks, was a tiny kitten, no more than a few weeks old, struggling to free itself from the debris. Emma gasped. Without thinking, she rushed to the water's edge, reaching out to pull the kitten to safety. But as she moved closer, Shadow let out a low growl, his body tense. He was not going to let anyone near the kitten. It took Emma a few moments to realize what was happening. Shadow had been protecting the kitten all along. His vigilance, his strange behavior, it all made sense now. The dog had been guarding something far more important than food or shelter. He had been guarding a life that needed help, and he wasn't about to let anyone interfere. As Emma gently pulled the kitten from the water, Shadow relaxed, his growl fading into a quiet whine. Emma cradled the kitten in her hands, marveling at the bond that had been forged between her and Shadow. It wasn't just about a stray dog and a lonely woman, it was about protection, loyalty, and the way animals could understand things that humans couldn't even fathom. But Emma still had one question left: why had Shadow been so protective of the kitten? What had driven him to guard it with such intensity? The answer would come soon, but for now, Emma knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Shadow, and together, they would face whatever mysteries life threw their way. As the days passed, Emma's life began to settle into a new rhythm, shaped by the presence of Shadow. The dog had quickly become an integral part of her world, his loyalty and protectiveness offering her a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She could no longer imagine her life without him, and despite the lingering grief she still carried over her mother's passing, Emma found herself smiling more, laughing again, and even looking forward to the future. However, Shadow's mysterious behavior, his protectiveness, his strange attachment to the drain, and his instinctive guarding of the kitten, continued to perplex her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him than met the eye. Something deeper, something that he was keeping hidden. One rainy afternoon, as Emma and Shadow sat by the window, the sound of distant thunder rumbling through the air, she found herself lost in thought. Shadow lay by her feet, his head resting on the floor, but his ears perked up every few moments as though listening for something far off. "Why are you so protective, Shadow?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. The dog lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, it felt as though he was trying to tell her something that she couldn't quite grasp. The days continued to blur, but Emma's curiosity about Shadow's past only grew stronger. She spent hours searching online for any information about stray dogs in the area, hoping to uncover something that would explain his strange behavior. But nothing came up. No one had reported a lost shepherd, and there were no signs of Shadow being part of a larger group or pack. It was as though he had simply appeared out of nowhere. One afternoon, as Emma walked Shadow through the park, she noticed something odd. The dog was acting strangely, his usual alertness had shifted into something more intense. He kept pulling at the leash, trying to go in the direction of the park's edge, near a small wooded area that bordered the town. Emma was wary, she had never ventured that far into the woods before. "Easy, boy," Emma said, trying to keep up with Shadow's determined strides. "Where are you trying to go?" Shadow didn't respond, but his pace quickened, and his eyes grew more focused. Emma's heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety. What was Shadow sensing that she wasn't? Finally, they reached the edge of the woods. Shadow immediately stopped, his body tense, his head low, sniffing the air. Emma stood beside him, looking into the dense trees, trying to make out any movement. But all she saw were shadows and the darkening sky. She turned to Shadow. "Is something out there?" Without warning, Shadow growled low in his throat, the sound deep and primal. He stepped forward into the woods, and Emma followed, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The air felt thick, and the forest seemed unnervingly quiet. Every step she took felt like it echoed in the stillness. The deeper they went, the more Emma began to feel a strange sense of urgency. It was as if Shadow was trying to get somewhere specific, somewhere that held answers to all the questions that had been nagging at Emma for days. After what felt like an eternity, they came upon a small clearing. In the center was a large, hollowed-out tree stump. Shadow walked right up to it and stood still, his head lowered, eyes fixed on the ground. Emma hesitated, her gut telling her that something was about to happen. She knelt down next to Shadow, her fingers brushing the damp earth beneath the stump. And then she saw it. Buried beneath the dirt, partially covered by leaves and debris, was a small, tattered bundle of fur. Emma gasped, her hand trembling as she reached down to uncover the mystery. She pulled back the layers of dirt and leaves, revealing a small, trembling animal, a dog, barely alive. Its fur was matted, and its tiny body was covered in wounds and bruises. But what shocked Emma the most was the faint, familiar whine that came from the animal as it tried to move. She knew that sound, it was the same sound Shadow had made when she first found him. "It's you," she whispered in disbelief, looking down at the tiny dog. "You've been protecting this dog all along." Shadow stood over the small creature, his body still tense, his eyes filled with an intensity that Emma couldn't describe. He had been guarding this helpless animal for who knows how long, keeping it hidden, making sure no one found it. The realization hit Emma like a wave. Shadow hadn't just been protecting a kitten or a drain, he had been protecting this dog, his own kind, all along. Emma carefully picked up the small animal, cradling it in her arms. She could feel its fragile heartbeat beneath her fingers, its body trembling from fear and exhaustion. "I'll take care of you," she promised softly. "Just like I did for Shadow." As they made their way back through the woods, Shadow walked beside Emma, his steps slower now, but still watchful. It was as if he knew that his mission had been fulfilled. He had found the lost dog, and now, he could rest. When they returned to the apartment, Emma immediately tended to the injured dog. She cleaned its wounds and wrapped it in a warm blanket. Shadow lay nearby, watching over the new arrival, his eyes filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Emma named the small dog Milo, after a character from her favorite childhood book. She wasn't sure how things would unfold from here, but she knew one thing for certain, her life had just changed in a way she hadn't expected. Shadow had shown her the meaning of loyalty, of devotion. But now, she had to show him that same loyalty in return. She owed him that, and so much more. The days following Shadow's discovery of Milo were a whirlwind. Emma poured all of her love and energy into caring for the small, fragile dog. Milo's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, she saw him grow stronger, his once weak and trembling body now beginning to show signs of life. He wagged his tail when Shadow entered the room, and though he was still shy and hesitant, there was a spark of gratitude in his eyes. Shadow, for his part, had settled into his new role as a quiet protector. He was always close to Emma, his watchful eyes never straying far from her. But now, he seemed to find solace in the presence of Milo. The two dogs had formed a bond, one that Emma couldn't help but marvel at. It was as though Shadow had been waiting for this moment his whole life, to find someone to share his heart with. One morning, as Emma sat in her small kitchen with a cup of tea, she looked over at Shadow and Milo, who were curled up together on the couch. Shadow's head rested on the armrest, while Milo lay pressed against him, seeking warmth and comfort. Emma couldn't help but smile, her heart full of affection for both dogs. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment in the woods, to the way Shadow had led her there, protecting Milo and ensuring no one found him. She still couldn't fathom how long Shadow had been carrying that secret, how long he had kept watch over Milo. It seemed as though he had known from the start that this small, helpless dog was in need of protection, and Shadow had taken it upon himself to be the guardian. Over the past few weeks, Emma had also learned a lot about herself. Caring for these two dogs had brought her closer to the person she had always been deep down, a person who could love and care for others, even in the midst of grief. Shadow had shown her that it was okay to open her heart again, that it was possible to heal, even after immense loss. And in caring for Milo, she had found a new sense of purpose, a new way to channel her love. But the bond between Emma and Shadow was the strongest of all. It was a bond forged in the quiet moments of companionship, in the late-night walks, in the shared experiences of healing and rebuilding. Shadow had been her silent guardian, just as she had become his. One evening, as the sun began to set and the cool breeze swept through the open window, Emma sat down on the floor with both dogs. Shadow sat by her side, and Milo curled up in her lap. The three of them formed a small, peaceful family, a family that had been brought together by fate and by the incredible loyalty of a dog who had never given up. Emma leaned back against the wall, feeling the weight of the day slip away. She had come so far since the day she had first met Shadow. Back then, she had been a woman grieving, lost in her own sorrow, unsure of how to move forward. But now, with Shadow and Milo by her side, Emma realized that she had found her way. Her life was no longer defined by loss, but by the love she shared with these two remarkable creatures. They had healed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. Together, they had created a family born not of blood, but of love, loyalty, and the understanding that no one, no matter how broken, was truly alone. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky outside, Emma closed her eyes, feeling at peace for the first time in a long while. Shadow's head rested on her shoulder, and Milo's small body was warm in her lap. The three of them sat together in the quiet stillness of the evening, content in the knowledge that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. And in that moment, Emma realized something profound. Family isn't just about who you're born to, it's about the connections you make, the bonds you form, and the love you give to those who need it most. Shadow and Milo had taught her that. They had brought her back to life in ways she could never have expected. And with them by her side, Emma knew that anything was possible. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found her place in the world again. And for that, she would always be grateful to the dog who had shown her the true meaning of loyalty. The bond between humans and animals is a profound and transformative connection that transcends mere companionship. In many ways, animals become not just pets but protectors, healers, and silent friends who offer unconditional loyalty and love. This relationship serves as a source of comfort and healing, especially during moments of loss or hardship. Just as Shadow in the story found purpose in protecting Milo, animals often exhibit deep instincts to care for those in need, demonstrating their capacity for empathy. In return, humans provide shelter, care, and emotional support, forming a symbiotic relationship that benefits both parties. In real life, countless people turn to animals for emotional comfort and healing, finding solace in their presence. Whether it's a dog offering protection, a cat providing companionship, or a horse helping with therapy, these animals enrich our lives in ways words often can't capture, reminding us that the bond between us and them is a deeply rooted part of our humanity.